At this point, I'll just move into the summary so Gearóid can come back on some of those points we raised towards the end of the meeting, also summarise his own points.
Yeah, yeah. Just in response to the last two interventions, and then to summarise a bit. Well, yeah, I mean, anti-communism is a key factor in Colombian society. That Colombia is one of the few countries in the world that had anti-communist, explicitly anti-communist organizations before there was ever a communist party in the country. And actually, even prior to the Russian Revolution, Colombia had anti-communist organizations formed and set up. And one of the main trade union federations, one of the ones that's been influential in calling off this range of protests, was founded actually as a sort of Catholic trade unionism in opposition to communist influence amongst workers. And the Colombian economy is a primary economy, depends on coal exports mainly to Europe, oil, flowers, coffee, gold to a lesser extent, and then that is it. In terms of actual industrial production, Colombia is way, way down the list compared to most other Latin American countries. Even smaller economies next door, like Ecuador and stuff like that, Colombia doesn't outdo them on any level. In terms of the organization of the youth and the influence that can have in the rest of Latin America, well, there'll be a certain amount of speculation on my part to say how that might affect it. But what can we say is Colombia is the jewel in the crown of the right. It has always been. It is the only country that in the 60s and 70s had no need to resort to military, or the 80s to military dictatorships. It had very authoritarian governments that were able to crush any opposition, very bloodily so, and without incurring the wrath of European liberals, the way happened with, for example, Chile. In Colombia in the 1970s, in the 1980s, they were murdering and torturing far more people than Pinochet. We have far more disappeared in Colombia than Argentina. In fact, you can put Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile together, and we still outdo all three of them together in terms of disappearances, in terms of murders, in terms of tortures. And Colombia was able to get away with that. And it's been the jewel in the crown of the right. So any fall in Colombia would have political repercussions. However, what are we likely to get next year with the elections? We are not going to have, he will be proclaimed as such, but we are not going to have Colombia's first left-wing president. Petro has abandoned any pretensions to being left-wing. And also should be said, he comes from a guerrilla movement, M19, which was always bourgeois in nature. It always described itself as looking for a bourgeois democratic regime. It wasn't even stagist and saying, let's have the bourgeois revolution and then the socialists, no, they were, let's have the bourgeois revolution and then we stop. What we're likely to have is a reinvention of the liberalism, in inverted commas, of certain sectors of the Colombian elite. He's likely to be no more left-wing than President Samper in 1994 to 1998, who was the last Liberal Party president of the country. So any moves, like I say, any pressure within Colombia towards the left, I mean, we've been inspired here by the movements in Chile, also the mass movement in Ecuador, etc. If Colombia were to fall, it would obviously have huge implications, would change the whole narrative. But that's not likely to happen, right? It's not likely to happen in the short term. We are here starting from scratch in many ways. And the electoral promise of next year is going to be a huge disappointment. And I think Petro will probably win the elections, but it's going to be a huge disappointment to many. And because he's demobilized the youth, when he runs up against problems around any social programs, he has nothing to fall back on. He doesn't want to mobilize people. He was illegally stripped of his role of mayor in Colombia many years ago, and he went through the entire bureaucratic process. They had protests, etc., but he never went outside of the institutions, and neither will he do so next year. And the Colombian military is, you often see interviews with military personnel from different dictatorships in Latin America, where they would say things like, well, we always kept to the sidelines in politics. We saw our intervention as a last resort. And there's a certain element of truth to that. They were observing, ready to pounce. But in Colombia, actually, the military have always been very, very political. At one stage in the 1990s, Samper had to remind the chiefs of staff of the army that he was the president, not them, right? So, you know, it's not like Petro is going to be able to do whatever he wants next year. He will need a mass movement, and he's made it quite clear that he doesn't want one. So, you know, whatever happens next year, it's not going to be the great triumph that some would think. Many of us, I'm sure Rob would be well aware of this as well, have made lots of criticisms of the pink tide in Latin America. Correa's government, which was actually quite right-wing in many ways. Correa actually comes from a traditional Catholic background, and his progressive politics are basically social conservative Catholicism. It's not, he's not a lefty. No one in Ecuador describes him as such. I've been there. Kirchners, the Kirchners are actually come from the right of the Peronists, right, etc. We are not even likely to get a pink tide here as red as the pink tide in the rest of Latin America. It's likely to be even a lot poorer. It will obviously give hope to people. And on this, I'll sort of finish. I mean, Petro's not going to introduce any major aims. And one of the reasons he wants to mobilize this mass movement now is he fears that he may have to deal with it himself in his presidency. And it would look really bad for him to be putting down mass protests the way they've been put down at the moment. And in terms of the violence in the country and the conflict, it's actually likely to continue because he will come to the presidency. The ELN wants a way out. They do. And they will do a deal with him, or they'll do a deal with Duque. But he's actually likely to make it a lot harder for them to do that for various reasons. So I don't think we're going to have any huge change through the electoral process. But I am actually quite hopeful about what I'm seeing with the young people and stuff in the streets and these new incipient organizations that have come into existence outside of the structures of the traditional left. And they don't have, beyond what we already said about making the police and the army answer for their crimes and the withdrawal of all of the measures and discussions around health and education, they don't have this well worked out program. But they may get there. And the program is likely to be a lot better than what any of the parliamentary left are doing, because what's termed the historic pact, which is this confluence of different forces, it includes most of the people who've been running the show for the last 30 years. Roy Barreras, for example, has been a senator for 20 years. Armando Benedetti was a major backer of Uribe. There are various other people who are around Santos who are also part of this historic pact. More than the arrival of the left into the presidency, it's going to be a reinvention of the Colombian oligarchy, of its political representation, which is not the first time this has happened. Uribe was a reinvention of its representation, where they brought in what we term here the narco bourgeoisie. they were brought into the fold was one of Pablo Escobar's long-term demands. Why, if they were responsible for such a significant part of the economy, were they excluded from political power? But really, it was the bringing in of that sector into the economy. Now we are going to have another reinvention of the representation of the oligarchy, which will include a whole range of former leftists and liberals. But to finish off, these protests have been very, very interesting. Are very, very interesting because they haven't ended. This is going to continue. They haven't ended. They've been very, very interesting, and the break with the bureaucracy has been the most interesting one. Every sector of society, the youths have said it, the farmers have said it, the victims' organizations, which are normally closely aligned to the NGOs and that whole discourse, have also said that that committee doesn't represent them. So, you know, there's a discussion there and the possibility to build an alternative to that. The one weakness is a fetishization of these sort of anarchist type of ideas of, you know, loose coordinating rather than an actual structured national body. But we'll see what will happen. It's early days yet. We're only 50 odd days into these protests. So it's all still to play for.